The 5 Stones by David Stonehouse. Chapter 1. Something Wicked. Janey brushed away angry tears with the back of her hand as the taxi completed its 3-point turn and drove away. She turned to face the road ahead. How far was it back to town? 2 miles? Maybe 3? It was late, the end of a sunny day, and as the light faded the temperature dropped and Janey's shorts and t-shirt were not keeping her warm anymore. She gripped the handle of the baby buggy and looked down at her tiny daughter who drowsed fitfully in the blankets. Ella would be awake and crying soon, Janey knew, and a wave of guilt and bitterness swept over her again. The path ahead followed the main road down the hill to the edge of the little town. The first house was probably 20 minutes away, and it was at least that far again to Janey's flat. She shouldn't be out this late with a baby. No proper, responsible mother would be in this mess, she scolded herself. Janey kicked off the brake and set off down the hill, rage driving her along. Her anger wasn't directed at the taxi driver who forced her to get out at the crossroads because she hadn't got the full fare. No, this was internal, self-directed loathing. She'd made a promise to change her life around when the baby came along. No more drugs. No more stumbling around in a haze blaming everyone but herself for everything that went wrong. She had meant it too, and when Ella arrived, Janey knew that she loved her with all her heart, but it was so hard. Too hard. And sometimes it hurt, and the craving got so bad that she couldn't fight it anymore. That was how it had been today. So she'd gone to the man, with all the cash she'd got, but he always wanted more and gave her less. Later still, she was miles away, guilty and ashamed, with a restless baby and nowhere near enough money to get them both home. Janey sniffed and wiped her eyes as the buggy's little wheels trundled along the path. I can't go on like this, she thought. I can't. I've got to try to be better. There were people she could go to, people who'd understand if she asked for help, but that was another terrifying thought in itself. What if they took one look at her pathetic disaster of a life and decided that she couldn't be trusted with herself, never mind a little baby? What if they wanted to take Ella away? Engrossed in these dark thoughts, Janey didn't notice what was happening around her. It wasn't until the background noises had become a strange slur that she started to pay attention. Glancing up curiously, everything looked wrong. The grass by the roadside and the branches of the trees seemed to be moving in slow motion. The notes of a bird's song stretched out like a record on an antique gramophone winding to a stop. The red car coming up the hill slowed to a standstill a few metres ahead, but the driver wasn't braking. It was as though the whole world was being put on pause. The slur of sound reduced down to total silence, and everything Janey could see froze to an absolute stillness. She looked down at baby Ella, who still squirmed, half dozing in her blankets. Reassured, she clicked on the buggy's brake with her foot and straightened up to try to make sense of it all. Shaking her head in wonder, Janey stared, gawping at the impossible things around her. Just down the hill, the driver sat like a waxwork, immobile in his red car, arms stretched out to the wheel, wide eyes locked on some point in the distance. The trees were impossibly still, and, incomprehensibly, a bird hung, wings spread a few feet from the branch it had just left. Ella gave an unhappy sniffle. Apart from Janey's own gasping panic breaths, there was no other noise in the world. Janey looked down at her baby. Ella was wriggling restlessly, her face contorting, clearly gearing up for a big cry. Then there was another sound, a sort of low whistling that made Janey look up again, wheeling round until she found the source of it. About 10 metres away, a small dark speck had appeared in the air. It hung impossibly in space, and it hurt the eyes to look at it. The speck expanded rapidly, becoming a ragged circular hole which opened onto a twisting tube of whirling colours. Within a couple of breaths, the tube was a tunnel large enough for a person to pass through, and in the distance, but approaching fast, Janey realised something was coming towards her. For a brief moment, Janey was frozen in terror, eyes wide, breathing ragged, and her heart thrashing in her chest. The thing kept coming, an indistinct, shambling shape with matted fur and eyes that blazed and glared. And then the moment passed, and another part of Janey's mind took over, telling her to run, like she'd never run before. Janey grabbed the buggy's handle, kicked off the foot brake and charged down the hill. Hair flying, eyes streaming and her chest burning, Janey raced away from the tunnel. She didn't dare to look back, but all the while she could hear the dragging of the creature's limbs and its wheezing breath closing in on her from behind. In despair, Janey whirled her aching legs on, but she already knew it was futile. Abruptly, the chase was over. Something seized Janey by the neck, and before she knew what was happening, she was flying backwards through the air, propelled by inhuman strength. She crashed back onto the tarmac, skidding along and losing the skin from her bare arms and legs. The back of her head thumped down on the ground, making her feel woozy and sick. Dizzily, she raised her head and saw the vile shape of the creature hunched over Ella's buggy. In desperation, Janey struggled to her feet and ran crazily back down the hill to help her daughter. She saw that the thing had lifted Ella from her blankets, and the little baby was screaming from the bottom of her lungs. Janey flung herself at the creature, but it was like hitting a wall. Her shoulder crunched nastily, and she slipped to the floor with blood filling her mouth, and her nostrils filled with a stench like rotting meat. Then her head exploded with pain as her hair was seized in a grip like a vice, and the creature began to drag her towards the open tunnel entrance. Janey clawed at the thing's wrist, but it made no difference. The arm that held her felt like iron wrapped in rags of fur, and nothing she could do would loosen its grip. She kicked and struggled furiously, but it did nothing to the creature as it dragged her over the threshold of the tunnel. Behind Janey, the circle of her world collapsed and dwindled and disappeared until all that was left was a nauseous maelstrom of light and colour. After the horrible absence of sound, the sudden howling rush as it returned was almost deafening. The frozen car gripped the road once again and roared on up the hill away from the lights of the little town. Ella's buggy had fallen on its side on the pavement. Her blanket and a small stuffed rabbit lay where they'd fallen on the tarmac. One of the buggy's little plastic wheels revolved forlornly in the gathering darkness.